He had no difficulty in finding words to express his thoughts. Sometimes incorrect, these very errors added to the energy of his language and always wonderfully expressed what he wished to say. These mistakes were not, moreover, inherent to his composition, but they were created rather by the heat of his improvisation, nor were they frequent, and were only left uncorrected when, the dispatch having been sent off at once, time was short. In his speeches to the Senate and to the Legislative Corps, in his proclamations, in his letters to sovereigns, and in the diplomatic notes which he made his ministers write, his style was polished and suited to its subject. Napoleon rarely wrote himself. Writing tired him. His hand could not follow the rapidity of his conceptions. He only took up the pen when by chance he happened to be alone or had to put the first rush of an idea onto paper. But after writing some lines, he used to stop and throw away his pen. He would then go out to call his secretary, or in his absence, either the second secretary or the secretary of state or General Duroc, or sometimes the aide-de-camp on duty, according to the kind of work in which he was engaged. He made use of the first who answered his call without irritation, but rather with a visible satisfaction, as being relieved from his trouble. His writing was a collection of letters unconnected with each other and unreadable. Half the letters to each word were wanting. He could not read his own writing again, or would not take the trouble to do so. If he was asked for some explanation, he would take his draft and tear it up or throw it into the fire and dictate it over again. The same ideas, it is true, but couched in different language and a different style. Although he could detect faults in the spelling of others, his own orthography left much to be desired. It was negligence which had become a habit. He did not want to break or tangle the thread of his thoughts by paying attention to the details of spelling. Napoleon also used to make mistakes in figures, absolute and positive as arithmetic has to be. He could have worked out the most complicated mathematical problems, and yet he could rarely total up a sum correctly. It is fair to add that these errors were not always made without intention. For example, in calculating the number of men who were to make up his battalions, regiments, or divisions, he always used to increase the sum total. One can hardly believe that in doing so he wanted to deceive himself, but he often thought it useful to exaggerate the strength of his armies. It was no use pointing out any mistake of this kind. He refused to admit it and obstinately maintained his voluntary arithmetical error. His writing was illegible, and he hated difficult writing. The notes, or the few lines that he used to write, and which did not demand any fixed attention, were, as a rule, free from mistakes of orthography, excepting certain words over which he invariably blundered. He used to write, for instance, the words cabinet, caffarelli, gabinet, gaffarelli, afenke, anfanke, infanterie, infanterie. The first two words are evidently reminiscences of his maternal language, the only ones which remain over from his earliest youth. The others, enfanque and infanterie, have no analogy with the Italian language. He had a poor knowledge of this language and avoided speaking it. He could only be brought to speak it with Italians who did not know French or who had difficulty in expressing themselves in our language. I have sometimes heard him conversing with Italians, and what he said was expressed in Italianized French, with words terminating in I, O, or A. It is said that Voltaire used to have a number of desks in his room, on one of which was a poem which he had begun, on another a tragedy, on others a piece of historical writing, and a pamphlet. The author used to pass from one kind of composition to the other according as the spirit moved him. Napoleon would deal with, in turn, at one sitting, matters relating to war, to diplomacy, to finance, to commerce, to public works, and so on, and rested from one kind of work by engaging in another. Every branch of the government was with him the object of a special, complete, and sustained attention. No confusion of ideas, no fatigue, and no desire to shorten the hours of labor. ever making themselves felt. Napoleon used to explain the clearness of his mind and his faculty of being able to will to prolong his work to extreme limits by saying that the various subjects were arranged in his head, as though in a cupboard. When I want to interrupt one piece of work, he used to say, I close the drawer in which it is and I open another. The two pieces of business never get mixed up together and never trouble or tire me. When I want to go to sleep, I close up all the drawers and then I'm ready to go off to sleep. The initiative in the drafting of all laws and regulations almost always came from Napoleon. His ideas of amelioration, improvement, and construction kept his ministers sufficiently occupied to need all their time in prescribing and supervising the numerous details of execution. If any regret can be expressed on this subject, it is that the unceasing activity of the highest intellect, which has ever been granted to a human being, should have accustomed his agents to await his inspiration and to distrust themselves. And that in consequence, so many men of talent should have found themselves paralyzed and taken by surprise in moments of danger. Napoleon knew that I did not possess, as he did, the precious gift of being able to go to sleep at will, and that I could not sleep in the daytime. After a piece of work which had occupied a part of the night, he would tell me to go and take a bath, and often gave orders himself that it should be got ready for me. He used sometimes to spend whole days without doing any work, yet without leaving the palace or even his workroom. In these days of leisure, which was but apparent, for it usually concealed an increase of cerebral activity, Napoleon appeared embarrassed how to spend his time. He would go and spend an hour with the Empress, then he would return and sitting down in a settee would sleep or appear to sleep for a few minutes. He would then come and seat himself on the corner of my writing table or on one of the arms of my chair or sometimes even on my knees. He would then put his arm around my neck and amuse himself by gently pulling my ear or by patting me on the shoulder or on the cheek. He would speak to me of all sorts of disconnected subjects, of himself, of his manias, of his constitution, of me, or of some plan that he had in his head. He was fond of teasing, never bitterly or nastily, but on the contrary, with a certain amount of kindness and accompanied with loud laughter. He would glance through the titles of his books, saying a word of praise or of blame on the authors, and would linger with preference over the tragedies of Corneille, Zaire, or Voltaire's The Death of Caesar, or Brutus. He would read tirades from these tragedies aloud, then would shut up the book and walk up and down, reciting verses from The Death of Caesar. The passages which he recited with the greatest pleasure were the following. This is in French. J'ai servi, commandé, vaincu 40 années du monde entre mes mains. J'ai vu les destinées et j'ai toujours connu qu'en chaque événement, le destin des États dépendait d'un moment. I'll try to translate this. I have served, I have commanded, I have conquered during 40 years the world in my hands. I've seen destinies. I've always known at every event that the destiny of the states depend on just one moment. Or again, Caesar, cause tout demander, Samber, la liberté, Cassius, tu nous l'avais promis et tu jurais toi-même d'abolir pour jamais l'autorité suprême. I'll try to translate this. Okay, what do you want, Cimber? I want liberty. Well, you can have that, but you have to promise yourself to abolish all supreme authority. When he was tired of reading or reciting, he would begin to sing in a strong but false voice. When he had nothing to trouble him, or he was pleased with what he was thinking about, it was shown in the choice of his songs. These would be airs from Le Devant du Village, the psychic of the village, or other old operas. One of his favorite songs was about a girl who was cured by her lover of a sting from a winged insect. It was a kind of anacreontic ode and consisted of one verse only. It ended with this line, "A kiss from his lips was the doctor in this case." When he was in a more serious frame of mind, he used to sing verses from the revolutionary hymns and chants, such as Chant du départ, Veillons au salut de l'Empire, the song of leaving, the salute of the empire, or he would hum these two lines. The man who wishes to bring the world under his sway must begin with his own country. Was this a piece of self-advice? I believe that he understood his country's happiness otherwise. All the powers of his ambition were strains who rendered the French nation great and prosperous. He never spoke of France, but in terms of affection. France had no rival in his heart nor in his mind. Her greatness was the object of all of his thoughts. The opinion that she had of him was his constant preoccupation, although outwardly he seemed to be indifferent to popularity. I must also speak of that tendency to superstition which has been attributed to Napoleon, for it is a generally accepted idea that he was under the spell of superstitious beliefs. It has even been said that he once consulted the famous Madame Lenormand. Endowed with the vast genius and a vivid imagination, Napoleon may have at times taken pleasure in straying into the regions of the world of speculation as a diversion from the realities of life. But so lofty an intellect, so positive a mind could not admit the prescience of the future, the inversion of the laws of nature, nor let himself be carried away by a sterile love of the marvelous. Like all superior geniuses, he had faith in his destiny. His successes from the very outset of his career, followed by greater and even unexpected successes, had inspired him with the idea that he was no ordinary man and that he was called to play a part on the world stage. Neither Vendémiaire nor Montenot, he used to say, led me to believe that I was a superior man. It was not until after Lodi that I began to think that I might become a decisive actor on our political stage. Then awoke in me the first spark of a high ambition. His march upwards afterwards confirmed him in this thought. This conviction was a surer oracle to him than the vain predictions of a witch. He drew his confidence from loftier sources. His maximum was, the future is in the hand of God. He used to say that after he had made the best arrangements on the day of battle, there came a moment when success no longer depended on him, and that he had to look for it from above. He could count on his good fortune in the execution of his most daring enterprises. This confidence, inspired by the constancy of his success, was warranted, but he was always prepared in advance for every reverse he might meet. Luck had no place in the conception of any of his plans. Before finally deciding upon them, he would subject them to the minutest scrutiny, every hazard, even the most improbable, being discussed and provided for. I saw Napoleon enjoying prosperity with the keenest pleasure, but I never once saw him betray any surprise. His measures were so well taken, and adverse chances so minimized by his calculations and arrangements that if anything could have surprised him, it would have been the failure of plans which he had prepared with so much skill and so much care. It is difficult to believe that even at a time when no revelation of his future destiny had been made to Bonaparte, still in obscurity, his strong and luminous mind can ever have yielded to the temptation to address himself to the puerile practices of necromancy. It is possible that in the extreme fervor of his love for Josephine, he might have allowed himself to be drawn into being present at a consultation with a witch, and that he made this sacrifice to the waywardness of the impressionable woman whom he so tenderly loved. However it may be, he did not approve of this weakness of Josephine and often turned it into ridicule. I was present when he forbade her to go see Madame Lenormand, and even had this famous juggler arrested. Josephine used to shroud her relations with this woman in the profoundest mystery, and never did the keeper of her privy purse know what sums the empress had paid for the witch's predictions. It is generally an accepted belief that great men have been or must be superstitious. The vulgar mob, which in that respect is really possessed by the superstitious feeling which it attributes to others, fancies that it is impossible to accomplish great things without supernatural means unknown to the rest of humanity. Others, in short, can only forgive such men their superiority by connecting them in some way with human weaknesses. But What is a superstition which is attributed to great men? Is it a belief in the occult and undefined powers? Is it, on the contrary, the faith which they have in themselves, or an intuitive perception of their own value? It is clear that it is in the former of these definitions that superstition lies. This aberration of the human mind cannot be applied to that inner feeling which led Napoleon, for example, to consider himself a divine instrument, charged with a mission on earth, and fated to march onward without fear, and with the certainty of success, under its powerful protection. When Napoleon used to say that the cannonball that was to kill him had not yet been cast, he did not yield to a feeling of fatalism. He considered that his providential mission had not yet been fulfilled. When he wrote to the Directoire that, having seen at the moment of landing in Egypt a sail which he believed to belong to one of the enemy's ships, he had implored fortune not to desert him, but to grant him 5 more days. He mentally translated the word fortune by the Almighty God. His exceptional situation, the consciousness of the mission which he had to fulfill, suggested to him the best means to secure its success. Thus, when in Egypt, he instructed his soldiers to show respect for the religion of Mahomet, for the ministers of this religion, and for its devotees, when he himself attended the religious ceremonies of the Mohammedans. His faith had not changed in the slightest degree. He was acting in the interest of a clever and well-mannered policy. His condescension toward the outward signs of Mohammedanism was limited to what was necessary to the success of his plans. He alleged meeting with the adepts in the pyramids, the oath which they exacted from him, and the instructions which they gave to him are so many clumsy inventions and are not worthy of refutation. In all the circumstances of his life, Napoleon showed that, far from being superstitious, he was penetrated with a profound and mysterious sentiment of the divine omnipotence. His habit of involuntarily signing himself with the cross on hearing of some great danger or on the discovery of some important fact where the interests of France or the success of his plans were concerned, at the news of some great and unexpected good fortune or of some great disaster, was not only a reminiscence of his early religious education, but also another manifestation of a feeling which led him to attribute these favors or these warnings to the author of all things. His expectation of help from above at a decisive moment in his battles, his frequent allusions in his conversations, proclamations, and reports to the only arbitrator who holds in his hands all plans and all events, the religious ideas which the sight of a church or the sound of a church bell awoke in his mind, the reestablishment of the Catholic religion in France, his taking refuge in the consolations of religion during his last moments at St. Helena. Do not all these things testify to his faith in Providence? The storm which had been gathering in the north of Europe burst forth 2 months after Napoleon's return from Italy. The emperor had been watching for 6 months previously the conduct of the Austrian government, which was trying to deceive him with pretended assurances of friendship and by the offer of an illusory mediation between France and England, and which replied to all questions as to their armaments, either with specious explanations or with formal denials. The friendly demonstrations of this power helped to mask her hostile intentions and to gain time. She took advantage of this to enter into secret negotiations with Russia and England. The Emperor of Russia had sent one of his chamberlains, Count Novosilkov, to Berlin, and the Prussian cabinet had asked for his passports in Paris, announcing that this extraordinary envoy was charged with a mission, the object of which had not been officially notified. Napoleon, in spite of this reticence, anxious to neglect no means of conciliation, ordered the passports which had been asked for to be sent on at once. The object of this mission, which could not be carried out, was a new proposal of intervention in conjunction with Austria between France and England, of which the Russian sovereign took the initiative and of which he was prepared to assume the responsibility. A mediation of this kind, this understanding between our enemies, the fatal result of which would have been to dictate the law to France, could not be accepted by us. This coalition of three great powers, one of which was making extraordinary preparations for a new war with the French Empire, whilst the others had never ceased to insult our government, was very naturally an object of suspicion in France. Napoleon was waiting to be informed of what was the proposed basis of the negotiation, when the news of the crossing of the Inn by a part of the Austrian army was suddenly received in Paris.